And, there are multiple sources who independently say of each other that there was bribery, there was blackmail, there was sexual blackmail, there was all kinds of politicking, pulling in favors.
Yoga in general is a bricolage, right?
There's telemarketing scams, many of them. There's smuggling, there's fraudulent art sales, there's gemstone scams. There's the drug dealing, the drug smuggling. You put all that together, it's disproportionate. If you had a high school where you had 20, 30, 40 people involved in felony level criminal activity, that would say something.
Attention all, a heads up before we proceed. Our discussion today will touch upon sensitive topics, including rape, sexual assault, sexual harassment, unethical behavior, and the creation of a toxic environment that allowed for various forms of abuse, including sexual, financial, mental, physical, and emotional. Please be aware that this content may cause distress or discomfort for some listeners. If you wanted to dive further into the details that we discussed, you can do so via the Olive Branch report that is linked in the description below. Okay, so today I'm pleased to welcome Stacie Stukin, I hope I pronounced that correctly, and Philip, I'm again probably going to butcher your second name, Deslippe?
Deslippe, very, very close.
Okay. I hope I didn't butcher your names as horribly as I think I did. However, they are both here today to help us discuss and evaluate the life and impact of Yogi Bhajan, whose full name is Harbhajan Singh Puri. Before we begin discussing Harbhajan, I'd like to learn more about the both of you. Stacie, if you wouldn't mind, could you please give us a brief introduction as to kind of who you are and your connection to Yogi Bhajan?
Sure. As you said, my name is Stacie Stukin. I'm a Los Angeles-based journalist who is a longtime yoga journalist. I covered in the yoga community for many years as a contributing editor for Yoga Journal, and covered kind of health and wellness for women's magazines for many years, and subsequently was a yoga practitioner who actually had taken many Kundalini classes and had written about the organization as a subject in yoga articles. But I had, growing up here in Los Angeles, 3HO had quite a presence. I lived quite close to where the Gurdwara is here and the main organization headquarters. So I was always aware of them. And I had always been very interested in them and had always heard rumors, had followed the growth of the businesses, especially after Yogi Bhajan died. There was some conflict, legal cases, etc. So to make a very long story short, I wrote a piece started reporting it at the very beginning of the pandemic. It was my pandemic lockdown project, and I published this big investigative piece in Los Angeles Magazine I believe it came out in the summer of 2020.
Yeah, I remember that. No, thank you for that. I was just remembering that when the article came out, because that's how I kind of was exposed to it properly, if that makes sense. Because again, like you were saying, I think a lot of us could probably, if we're honest with ourselves, always heard of kind of rumors and stuff. However, we also would like, Philip, if we could, to get a brief introduction as to who you are and also kind of your connection to Yogi Bhajan.
So again, thank you for having me. My name is Philip Deslippe. I'm finishing up a PhD in the Department of Religious Studies at UC Santa Barbara in California. My initial exposure to 3HO, it's kind of like a cautionary tale that you hear in kind of anti-cult circles. My very first week as an undergraduate in university, I took a free Kundalini Yoga class. So I did the yoga for several years. I taught the yoga. I was involved kind of on the periphery of the 3HO community, different 3HO communities in the US. And then in 2008, I started a master's program, and I started developing tools as a researcher. And a light bulb went off as I was researching early yoga teachers in the United States from 100 years ago. It occurred to me that, a lot of these people made their lineages up. And I wondered, I wonder what would happen if I turned the lens onto Yogi Bhajan. And so I started doing research, and the fruits of that came out in 2012 when I published an article in the academic journal Sikh Formations on the history of Yogi Bhajan's yoga. And I kind of assumed that that would be it. And that 3HO would just kind of keep going on. And then in early 2020, a lot of, first a few people, and then a lot of people started opening up and telling their stories about abuse and misconduct at the hands of Yogi Bhajan with other parts of the organization. And then everything kind of very quickly unraveled. And then I was contacted by Stacie as she was reporting her story for Los Angeles Magazine. And after her article came out, it became clear that the story wasn't going to go away. And I think even more than that, it was clear that the story of 3HO was very complicated, very nuanced, and very big. So Stacie and I started reporting together. We did a piece for the Wire service, religion news service. And then as we kept reporting, the fruits of our collaborative work came together with this long-form investigative piece for Boz, where I think you really see for the first time with specificity and clarity and detail exactly how the whole thing worked, how Yogi Bhajan built up his empire, how he maintained control over his followers, and really the mechanisms that enabled his abuse to go on for decades and decades.
There's a question that's just come to me whilst you've both been talking about Yogi Bhajan and 3HO, and it wasn't on in the Google Doc that I shared beforehand. So I apologize if it puts you guys just on the spot. But for someone who's lived, I've grown up in the UK, so our exposure to 3HO, if I'm quite honest, is very limited, and they've always been, and it might come across slightly rude, but within the UK, they've always been seen as kind of the weird hippie Sikhs who have kind of taken Sikhi to somewhere else, yeah? Some people may disagree, but kind of by and large within a lot of kind of the UK Sikh circles, that's always kind of been the view of them. But as you guys have been talking, it kind of comes across as though they're the Sikh community is the 3HO. It almost seems as though kind of they're interchangeable, and it's almost like the Sikh, it's almost like the Sikh culture and 3HO sometimes can't be kind of differentiated. Am I kind of taking too much out of what you guys are saying, or kind of to what extent does that hold water?
I think here in this, and I have learned this, in our reporting, and this may be territory that's more familiar to Philip, but, as somebody who did not know a lot about Sikhi growing up, you'd see, oh, those are the white Sikhs. And you knew that there were Punjabi Sikhs, but I thought they were just converts of conventional Sikhi. And I think that is one of the ways that they were able and continue to be able to kind of, have these businesses grow the yoga, and people don't question it because people don't know. Because I think you're dealing with an American population that doesn't know a lot about Sikhi, and they don't know the kind of, the variations and why it's different. And when you say that seems like this hippie iteration, that's correct, because that's the origin. The origin were hippies from the 60s who wanted to get high on their breath.
Yeah.
Philip, I'm sure you have more to add to that. Yeah.
Well, no, I think, one of the big differences between the US and the UK has a huge Sikh population that's very concentrated. And I think by and large, the non-Sikh British population is familiar with who Sikhs are. There's a lot of contact and familiarity. That's not necessarily true in the United States. You have pockets of Sikhs in the U.S., up West Coast, into major cities. But especially after the 70s, you often have Sikh families who are the only Sikhs for 10, 20 miles around. So the United States, there wasn't a lot of familiarity with Sikhs. And the 3HO6, they're American. They're, often, well-educated middle class converts who were very comfortable talking to local newspapers and being forward. So in many ways, if they were seen to represent Sikhs as a whole, that's because a lot of times they were the ones to step forward and claim that they were representing Sikhs in whole. But there's also a very kind of weird dynamic that's going on, because behind the scenes, 3HO6 have a very particular and often very derogatory view of Punjabi Sikhs coming from Yogi Bhajan down. And they're often not very forward with what exactly they're doing. So, on a public stage, they will claim this shared religious identity. We are Sikhs. And Punjabi Sikhs have often found common cause with 3HO6, to allow turbans and kesh in certain jobs or in the military. But behind the scenes, and often in private, Yogi Bhajan would say, these Punjabis, they lost their tradition. They don't know what they're doing. You are the true sons and daughters of Guru Gobind Singh. There was even a saying in 3HO in the 70s, the sun will rise in the west. This kind of inversion of the sun rising in the east, basically saying that Guru Gobind Singh's vision would be fulfilled not in India, but in the United States.
In the West, yeah. No, thank you for answering that. So just kind of for those who are probably slightly unfamiliar, who is Harbhajan Singh Puri? Like, what do we know about him, and how does he end up in LA? Because from the little bit of research I did, he's originally born in India and then moves over sometimes, I think, in the 70s. Obviously, I'll leave you guys to add more clarity to that picture.
We know that he's a customs agent at Palam Airport in Delhi. There are various rumors of why he leaves India. And of course, you always have these layers. You have the official story from 3HO, you have the stories that other people tell, and then you have more likely reasons kind of below the surface. So Yogi Bhajan says that he comes to the West because he sees hippies going to India. In his role in the Palam Airport, he sees hippies going to India and getting ripped off. And he feels like they need real teachings. They need someone to show them the true path of spirituality. So that's why he says he comes to Los Angeles. He actually goes to Canada before he goes to Los Angeles. And we have from numerous sources, he leaves Canada because he got a woman pregnant there, and he flees and he goes to Los Angeles. There is good evidence that when he goes to LA, he doesn't think of himself primarily as a yoga teacher. He told one of his first hosts that he wanted to get into an import-export business, like selling fabrics and beads, which would make sense for a customs inspector. But I think he very quickly realizes that, with a little bit of yoga and being a tall Punjabi man in a turban in Los Angeles in late 1968, it doesn't take long for people to start assuming that you're a guru or a yoga master or some sort of spiritual teacher. And so, yeah.
So when he arrives in the late 60s, is it also kind of like, I'm not trying to take away from him as kind of the actor of what's happening, but in terms of the context of the environment he arrives in, like the hippie movement and all of that, like, as in, does that almost allow him to make this transition into being a yoga teacher slightly easier than, say, if it was like a decade later or even today?
I think absolutely. I mean, you're dealing with, a group of people who are experimenting with drugs. They're experimenting with Eastern thought. They're, looking to the East for spiritual enlightenment as a different than the religion, the conventional religions that they grew up with. And here he is presenting himself as, and I mentioned this, in the opening, I can teach you how to get high on your breath. I can teach you how to live healthy, be a vegetarian. And these are all, ideas in the zeitgeist of the 60s. And in fact, you know, he did align himself with, there were some connections into the, rock and roll scene as well. So it was like all these things kind of converged at the perfect time for him to just, gain a following. And so, for example, there's an antique dealer here in Los Angeles who opens up his shop for yoga classes, and then people start flooding in. He starts teaching them kirtan. So these young people who are interested in music are start creating their own musical groups, and it just becomes a scene, as they would say back then.
It's almost like a subculture of its own. It's almost kind of like, I don't think it's as comparable, but it's kind of like how you have subcultures like, I don't know, like reggae came out of like a particular subculture, like, I guess similar in a similar way. So in that first decade or so, is there any rumor or proof or kind of anything pointing towards what comes up later on with kind of Yogi Bhajan's behavior and kind of what he's doing at that time?
Well, and we haven't spoken about this yet. There's a couple of things. Maybe for example, in the Premka memoir, White Bird and Golden Cage, she describes her first yoga class with Yogi Bhajan, and he puts his hand on her breast. So right there, that indicates there's some sexual misconduct from the beginning.
Yeah. No, I think what happens in the beginning is people close to Yogi Bhajan, many of them have a clear sense of who he actually is. He kind of gets tossed around like a hot potato from one person hosting him to another. He's with Dr. Amarjit Singh Marwa, who then hands him off to Warren Stagg, who's a restaurant owner, who then hands him off to Judith Tyberg, and then Judith Tyberg kicks him out of her East-West Center. So the people who were closest to him, it didn't take long for people to realize he's kind of a creep, he's kind of a pest. I don't want him in my house. I don't want him around my people. And so I think, directly from word of mouth, there were people who knew. But I think one of the dynamics that we saw in our reporting is that in order to not speak poorly of someone, in order to not start rumors, in order to not make communities of people potentially look bad, there's a lot of people who kind of carry around knowledge of what he was up to. But because they're not open with it, the public at large doesn't really know. But there's a clear sense when you look at all of these people that it wasn't a matter of no one knowing for a period of time, or Yogi Bhajan getting worse over time. He really, as you read in Premka's memoir, he really hits the ground running. He's abusing and assaulting and taking advantage of people from his first steps in Los Angeles.
Stacie, you'd mentioned earlier about how you were tracing kind of the growth of the 3HO and especially some of the businesses. And something that I always found really interesting, this was probably the year or so prior to kind of your article coming out, there was a lot of focus on the car security and their cooperation with ICE at the time, and there was a big kind of uproar within the Sikh community about that. But what I was in particularly kind of wanting to get your input on was, how is Yogi Bhajan able to take, so like as in he's an ex-customs officer, he turns up in the US in the late 60s, like how is he able to go from literally a guy off the plane into then building up these businesses, including a car security, and on top of kind of his own personal wealth? Like I know people who have been working for decades and they still don't manage to pull that off, and he seems to be able to turn up and it just happens. Like what's actually going on behind the scenes, and is it as kind of sparkly and golden as it as it appears on the outside, or is there kind of more going on behind the scenes?
There's a lot of elements to that question, but I would start off by saying that for whatever reason, he attracted some pretty smart entrepreneurial people. And with his guidance, or it was not always the kindest guidance, but they were very motivated to do good. And I think it started as, again, with that hippie ethos. You know, we want to live in community. We want to create businesses for ourselves so we can prosper. Also, the philosophy that he was teaching within yoga was we are householder yogis. There's a lot of prosperity talk, prosperity meditation. You know, there's no shame in driving a white Mercedes and wearing a lot of jewelry. And so that was almost, you know, kind of a goal. So you have all these entrepreneurs, they start out and they start out in the health food business, and they happen to ride the wave of the wellness, natural foods growth. So they start that. There are vegetarian restaurants throughout the country. They start natural foods distribution companies. And then there's the Yogi Tea Company as well. And a call starts out there, you know, he's kind of teasing on the Sikh tradition, you know, militarism and security. And they start doing security for small concerts in Albuquerque, for example. And the business kind of grows exponentially. There's also some political influence that he starts to develop in New Mexico. And it's a small state, and they have a big presence. And they have a physical presence. Presence. I mean, you see 3HO Sikhs, and they're wearing white turbans, all white. They have jewelry on. You kind of can't miss them, right? So they use that to their advantage as well. And so they start to gain political capital, and they start getting these bigger and bigger contracts. And I think after 9/11, one of the men running the company, I believe it was Stacie Stukin, you know, gets a meeting with George W. Bush to talk about, you know, anti-Sikh sentiments, and to talk about security. So then they start getting more and more contracts. And in addition to ICE, they were also earlier working for a company that would fly deported. They were doing security for an aviation company that would fly deported people back to their home country. So the ICE thing started, that wasn't just something that started last year. That's been a consistent contract that they have had in with those kinds of incidents.
Yeah, I think one way to understand the growth of the businesses is it was kind of like Aikido. Yogi Bhajan could use the enthusiasm and the hopes and the motivations of his students and then direct it towards his own ends. So there's a documentary from the early 70s called Sunseed, and there's a great little clip that shows Yogi Bhajan in New York City it's late 1969, early 1970. And it seems kind of ridiculous. He's using hippie slang. You see him kind of very awkwardly saying something is far out. Far out. But I think that's very telling because he, like a customs officer, he could pick up on what was motivating people, what they were afraid of, what they were hoping for, what they liked.
Possible in the way by hooting and shooting, you are going to get everything. All you are the future of United States of America, and nobody is going to take away everything from you. You are to be peaceful, you are to be great, And you have to do one thing: peace within your heart should lead you to have everything what you need. But be peaceful, calm, and absolutely quiet. They will give you what they call themselves to be. And today is their day, tomorrow is our day.
And so he is building them up by saying, you know, we can be this great spiritual nation. We have to create our own businesses. We have to prepare for the future. All the while, the actual structure of the businesses, who controls things, where the money is going, that's all going to him. And several people that we talked to, they said, if you take aside the exploitation and the various dynamics, it's an incredibly effective way to build up a business. You know, what entrepreneur wouldn't want to have a dedicated workforce that, you know, you can cut corners with, like, you know, labor laws and things like that. And several of them said, you know, the little hiccups and the trials that a new business would have, they could get through that because it was a religion. People literally felt that they were doing God's work by, you know, working in these kind of businesses and building them up.
One other point to the ability for the businesses to grow well and grow quickly is, again, using that religiosity and the concept of seva, whereby people were working for free or for substandard wages. So even, you know, at a certain point before Yogi Bhajan's death, you know, people who were running multi-million-dollar companies like Akal or Yogi Chi were making well below what a contemporary at another company would be making, a comparable position. So that also really helped. I mean, when you don't have to pay people, when you're paying them like in, you know, mung beans and chai tea, and you get free meals and you can live in the ashram and you can teach the yoga, and that's what your life is focused around. It's pretty easy to build a business when you don't have a lot of expense, when you don't have to pay people very well.
I think the shock for me is more so, like, I didn't quite understand the extent to kind of how almost every facet of what is happening is, in some way, like, they've taken an element of Sikhi and almost turned it on its head. So the idea of seva, and they've just flipped on its head the idea of, and it's like, and it just makes, like, it makes my blood boil. But anyway, putting that aside, it's just, yeah. And anyway, so one of the things that
You don't have to put that aside.
no, but as in, no, definitely not. But in terms of just to ensure kind of we go down the conversation that I had planned rather than kind of off on a tangent. So one thing that you both kind of already stated really is that people are aware of Harbhajan kind of from the get-go. In kind of, he's almost, well, he, as you said, he's kicked out from one place to the other. I think in the article that I read, it mentioned there was a civil lawsuit in the 80s and also a DEA bust. Now, what's going on there, and how is all of this kind of brushed aside? Because it seems as though nothing stops him. Like, nothing is stopping the growth of the companies, stopping the growth of 3HO. It just seems like these are blips that are ignored.
Well, they're two different. So I guess they're around the same time. So the lawsuit, which was brought by Pamela Sahara Dyson, also known as Premka, and another woman. Her name is Kate Felt. Her Christian name is Kate Felt. He basically wore them out. I mean, they kept trying to sue. They found they had somebody paying their lawyers, and if you read, you can find those complaints online. If you read them, they're very disturbing allegations of rape and abuse financial, sexual, physical, emotional, spiritual. And he kept stalling. And he kept saying his health wasn't good, or he would get a medical exemption. So he got these medical exemptions, and he basically wore out the people who made the complaints.
And then that was a very kind of standard Yogi Bhajan 3HO thing to do with a lot of these lawsuits. The overarching strategy is always stall, delay, deny, and if there is a reckoning, settle out of court. Yogi Bhajan in his lifetime never had a day in court. He never had to sit on the witness stand and answer questions under oath. And the other dynamic I think that was at play was exposing 3HO would have been very bad for non-3HO Sikhs. Think of the time that it's happening. This is the mid-1980s. You have a lot of Sikhs in the U.S. who, in a very real and literal way, are saving their lives by being outside of India. You don't want any bad news to come out about the Sikhs. And so that is one reason I think that a lot of non-3HO Sikhs and non-3HO Sikh leaders didn't want to talk too loudly about what they suspected or what they knew as fact about what was going on in 3HO. And I mean, you also have to, in the 90s, put it in the context of other scares that happen with religious cults in the United States. You have Jonestown, you have the raid on the Branch Davidians. I think that was also a concern of, if you expose 3HO too much, would the community be subject to the same kind of raids that happened in other places? And also Yogi Bhajan had influence. He had influence, he had these claimed titles, and 3HO, Sikh Dharma, is a religion, and Americans are very hesitant to poke around in the affairs of a religion. So I think it's kind of a perfect storm to insulate Yogi Bhajan and kind of keep the abuse going for as long as it did.
Yeah, and I think his connections within the Punjabi community here in the States also, as Philip just stated, helped kind of shut that down a little bit too. Because, there was this sense that they, as he said, which is so unfortunate because it could have exposed things a lot earlier. And in terms of the drug bust, Philip and I were talking about this the other day, the irony that, 3HO has this whole, anti-drug program called Super Health, but at the same time, they're busted for smuggling drugs. I think it's like 87, 88, 20 tons of marijuana coming in from Thailand.
The largest drug bust in American history up to that point.
So, I'm sure you guys are aware in Sikh traditions, cannabis isn't frowned upon, but that's a lot of that's a hell of a lot of cannabis. Jesus, yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I mean, they're not, grinding it up to Suka before riding on horseback. This is weed that was, those garbage compactors that you see behind the supermarket?
Yep.
They have those on board the boats to
compress it.
Press the weed so you can smuggle twice
as much as possible. Yeah.
3 times as much. It's astounding.
And but as in so this happens, and I'm sorry, actually, hold on, let me take a step back. I was going to actually ask you how he managed to get himself. So my earliest exposure to Yogi Bhajan was seeing a photo of him stood next to Sant Jarnail Singh Ji. And I think, to be fair, most people in the UK are exposed to him through that, especially my generation.
Yeah.
And I always wondered, I was like, why? Because a lot of people in the UK will get the 3HO confused with another Sikh community who I wouldn't say are comparable, but they wear white and they're called the Nanaksars. And so I always, as a youngster, was like, why? How has this guy managed to get in the middle of like the heart of the problem in the 80s and get this photo? From what you guys have been saying, it seems like a lot of it was kind of politics, because as in he knew having that photo has cemented his legacy, because like Jesus, like I'm talking to you about the photo today, but is it as sinister as that, which is he is literally playing politics to ensure his own survival? So as in, because I think everything that I've heard so far is he's just taking what's available in this religion because he knows it will keep the people below him following, but he's just flipping everything on its head. So he knows the community obviously respect this man, so he's like, I'll go and get a photo with him and I'm kind of good to go.
I mean, so to ask you a rhetorical question, Amar, why do people pay $5,000 a plate for a political fundraiser?
Because of the access, like what you can do with it. Yeah,
and so you can get that picture of you shaking hands with Donald Trump or Joe Biden at the end of it. You know, your question of like, was it that sinister? You know, Stacie and I we've been in 3HO stuff up to our necks, and we're still constantly surprised at how sinister it can get. And, you know, there are multiple sources who independently say of each other that there was bribery, there was blackmail, there was sexual blackmail, there was all kinds of politicking, pulling in of favors. You know, how does Yogi Bhajan get access to a lot of these people? It's, you know, start from the beginning. When he first goes to India in late 1970, what's the first stop that they make? It's the Prime Minister's palace, and he has his students doing yoga asana for Indira Gandhi.
Wow. Damn, fair. Okay, I think that says everything, really. Yeah, if you're literally in the trappings of power, then yeah, of course, there's obviously a lot more to that. I was going to ask you something else, and it's completely slipped my mind. It was just off the back of what you were saying. Hopefully, it'll come back to me. Yeah, it's just that's the more I'm learning about this, the more I'm just like having to process it and be like, actually, like, oh, this was the question. So when I was doing my university degree, we did this topic that was all about religious fundamentalism. And you mentioned Jonestown earlier, and we did a whole kind of like 6 weeks or whatever on kind of Jonestown and the cult and everything else. And now, and kind of, correct me obviously if I'm wrong, but from listening to what you guys have been saying, a lot of the power that Yogi Bhajan is wielding is kind of, it is primarily religious, but it's also kind of through the use of blackmail and other methods. What I'm trying to get at is how comparable is what's happening with Yogi Bhajan and 3HO to something like Jonestown or other cults that are kind of as infamous as that? Is it, I guess what I'm trying to ask is 3HO at a point where if Yogi Bhajan told everyone to drink the, whatever that juice was that had the poison in, they'd all do it? Because like, for me, Jonestown is something that's never left my mind because of how insane I think it is that so many people can do the same act all at the same time, and like just like that human instinct of survival just seems to have just disappeared. How close is it? Like how, like I don't quite know what the words are. Like, is it indoctrinated? Is it kind of abused into submission? I don't quite know what the words are, but like how comparable are those cults, I guess?
Would you like to talk about the coming insanity, Stacie?
Well, I was going to ask you if you wanted to talk about the coming insanity. I feel like I can talk about the 3HO part of it, but Philip, maybe you can talk about the new religion movement part of it.
Uh-huh.
So this kind of goes back to even the growth of the businesses and his acquisition of assets, whether they be homes or businesses, from his followers, because there was a time in the, starting in the mid-70s going through the 80s, right, Philip? Where there was this coming insanity. The world was going to go insane, and we all had to be prepared for it. And we were going to create this great Khalsa Commonwealth. And he says over and over in his lectures that this commonwealth is here to take care of the, the widows, the children, the community. And so part of their motivation for building the businesses was to, to be able to ride out the insanity. There's meditations for nuclear fallout. There's meditations like if there's an earthquake. There's meditations, to avoid death. There's, it's a meditation manual called Survival Guide, Survival.
I think the survival kit.
The survival kit. Thank you. So there's also talk of, people are preparing. They've got their, they're going to walk from. There was an ashram head in San Diego, I believe, told Philip that they were getting ready to walk from San Diego to New Mexico, because New Mexico, they were going to all be safe there. So they had, their supplies ready for when things went completely awry. And there was a comet that was, coming to Earth to destroy them all. So there was that kind of dystopian end of the world talk going on that definitely helped infuse fear and made people stick to the community even closer.
Right. And Yogi Bhajan always, the very beginning, he always talked about his death. When he first comes to Los Angeles, he says, I'm teaching you this very secret, hidden yogic tradition, and I'm doing this at risk to myself. And you look at the early lectures, he's saying things like, I might not be around next year. This could kill me. People don't like the fact that I'm teaching this yoga. So he's always putting it out from the very beginning through the 70s and 80s. I have enemies. I could get attacked. They might try to get me. So, when you ask the question of what's the difference between 3HO and the Branch Davidians and Jonestown and these other religious groups they're infamous, I think the easy answer is all the ingredients are there in 3HO. The fact that it didn't have the kind of combustible chemical reaction that the other groups did doesn't take away from the fact that all those elements are there. That a lot of the same rhetoric, the stockpiling of weapons, the nameless enemies that are out to get us, it's all there. And also the strangeness of Espanola, New Mexico being envisioned as this kind of center of the world. When everything goes awry, Espanola, New Mexico, this tiny little town, an hour or so away from Albuquerque, that's going to be the one safe haven. There was talk that they were going to build a giant temple of steel outside of Espanola, and that this structure, which would have a gurdwara and other things, it was going to alter weather patterns. It was going to be recognized as a tucket by the Sikh pump.
Oh, wow. It gets it, like, as in the layers. I'm just amazed at like the layers to it, as in so I can almost stomach it to a degree, and then I'm like, damn, he even thought of that. Like, as in, it's just like, I don't know how you can detail a lie so brilliantly, and I think actually that's perhaps some of why he's able to continue doing what he does. Yeah, sorry, I cut you off there. So please continue.
But I think one of the, you asked the question earlier, and I think this is a question that has a lot of parts to it. How did he get away with it? And I think, and these aren't exclusive, I think being able to be dismissed as a Sant Baba or a Dera from other Sikhs kind of allowed a lot of it to be dismissed. Well, that's what they do. Of course they're corrupt. Of course he's doing that. But also for a lot of Punjabi Sikhs, it was the idea that Sikhi is a world religion that middle-class white Americans would convert to. That's a very seductive idea, especially when you're immigrants coming to the UK or coming to the US or Canada. If you're worried about how your own children will retain their Sikhi in Canadian or American society, and you see these white middle-class suburban kids converting to Sikhi and growing their hair and tying turbans, I think that allowed a lot of people to not see a lot of things that they would otherwise be really offended by. And you see that today. I mean, you can even go on Twitter and see a lot of young Sikhs who say, we should do our banis just like these people do. If only, we were that proud of our Sikhi, while ignoring everything else.
It's that cloak of religiosity, though, which is, it's like the thinness of it, and if it's just the subtlety of being able to see that. And I think, unfortunately, I'm just lost for words for some of this. So one thing that Philip, you'd mentioned almost like right at the beginning of our conversation was kind of his legitimacy of teaching and his lineage, I guess. And it's something that I find really interesting and quite peculiar, because anyone who's done any type of martial art will automatically know that's kind of like, again, it's comparable, but it's something where you normally try and verify the person's lineage to make sure what they're teaching you is legit and not just something off the street or whatever. Equally, a lot of people who may be familiar with the Sikhi setup are very familiar with, for argument's sake, they're a descendant of the Bairupa family, who were very close associates with Guru Hargobind Sahib Ji, and they still look after some of the artifacts that belong to the Guru still to this day. And so lineages are obviously very important within the Sikh setup. So how and what does Harbhajan do, and how is it, like, how actually, let me rephrase that. How did you kind of start, like, where did you start in the rabbit hole and where did it lead? Because it just sounds like you pulled a thread and everything kind of came undone very quickly.
I mean, I think the easiest explanation of where Yogi Bhajan's Kundalini Yoga comes from is it comes from exactly where Yogi Bhajan said it did early on in his arrival into the United States. So he mentions several people that he studied with. And if you go to those people, and if you go to the books that he mentions, it's all there. He's just pulling bits and pieces from these various people, all of whom he names explicitly in early 3HO periodicals. He takes physical practices from Swami Dhirendra Brahmachari, from another Hindu yoga teacher, Swami Devmurti. He is taking some exercises from the books of Swami Shivananda. He is open about the time that he spent with Baba Virsa Singh at Gobind Sadhan outside of Delhi. So he is taking from these various places and he is putting it all together, and he then makes claims about the yoga he teaches that are just not verifiable. He says that it's ancient, it used to be secret, no one taught it openly, all of these things that would close off any kind of inquiry or any kind of actual lineage. And I think you made a great point, which is the Sikh tradition it's happening in the full light of history. There is a ridiculous amount of art, documentation, artifacts, oral history, written history. We know in incredible detail what is happening with the lives of the 10 Sikh gurus. We know what poets Guru Gobind Singh was paying at his court. We know when Guru Hargobind is asking specific disciples of his to do this or do that from this village. Some of it still exists today. And the claims that Yogi Bhajan makes, it only works if you have an audience who is detached from that history and doesn't know any better. He makes claims that Guru Nanak Dev Ji, Guru Ram Das Dev Ji, Guru Gobind Singh Dev Ji, that they were all doing yogic practice. Where does that show up in Itihas? If Guru Gobind Singh is doing these yogic kriyas, no one thought to write it down. No one saw it. You have the Mughal court, you have travelers and people from all parts of Asia and beyond who are chronicling what they see with the Sikhs. No one's mentioning this yogic tradition.
Yeah, no, completely.
Well, the other thing to point out is that how he could get away with it here in the States is that his white followers, their only source of information about Sikhi came from him. So they didn't have I think later some who left maybe did go to learn more about Sikhi and began to understand some of the strange, inconsistencies, things that were incongruous. But in general, their main source of Sikhi was him. And, what in our Boz article, one of his early disciples said, he was like the Pope. If that's what he said, that's the way we took it. Well, there still is, while we were reporting our Boz piece, there is still a reluctance amongst people in the Punjabi community to talk to us about it. They don't, and one person even said, well, he's dead. But the organization still lives on, right? And it has created, an institutional structure of abuse. And it's an organization that still has influence. Like, for example, the Vaisakhi celebrations here in Los Angeles, 3HO, pays for, and it's a big deal. That's just one small example. So yeah, and also in in India, that for a long time he had some influential supporters.
His portrait is still hanging in the Central Sikh Museum in Amritsar.
Which is insane. And especially, it's just insane on any level. Well, no matter how you look at it, it's insane. And I'm going to keep that bit in the podcast to put myself on record, because it's just nuts. Like, the levels of the abuse, every facet of it is just. I think what is shocking is the fact that no kind of page has been left. Like, everything has almost been thought of in order to ensure kind of this can continue and keep going. But yeah, it's at least, I guess, actually no, it's not a positive that it's now coming out. I think the only positive would have this been nipped in the bud as soon as possible. It's just an absolute travesty that for whatever reasons various community members just didn't say anything for whatever reason. But again, I guess you can't necessarily apportion blame like that.
Well, this is a weird point of comparison, but this happened to me a few days ago. I'm out walking the dog, and as happens sometimes when you walk the dog, I stepped in a bit of dog waste, and it's on my shoe. I did what anyone else would do, which is what? Dear God, wash the shoe out. Wash out the part of the car. I'm going to wash the floor. I'm going to do everything I can to get rid of every trace of that. And it's for no bigger reason than it smells bad and it makes me feel a little bit gross. If I'm going to go through all of that trouble, which anyone would, it's even more insane to think that in the wake of knowing about massive systemic abuse, dozens of women who were sexually assaulted and raped and groomed from childhood, hundreds of then children who were abused in 3HO boarding schools, the financial exploitation of generations of followers, lies and deception in the name of Sikhi, blackmail, bribery on a huge scale. And the response from so many people is, well, he's dead now. Well, that's in the past. That's insane. And I think it really is a kind of calling the bluff of so many people's claims to morality and kind of spiritual advancement. You know, you're going to be nitty pitty. You're going to be a spiritual warrior. You're going to be, you know,
you're going to claim to be the big one, and then if it's like when shit literally hits the fan, you're like, yeah, it's got nothing to do with me, I'm out.
Yeah. I mean, if you saw someone who got hit by a car on the side of the road, would you like just walk past?
I think, personally speaking, and this bit I will have to edit because it will get me in trouble.
A few moments later.
Just coming back to, so both of you have already mentioned the book Premka, White Bird in a Golden Cage, My Life with Yogi Bhajan. So this is the book by Pamela Dyson that was published, I believe, the beginning of January 2020. And this really brought everything to the forefront, along with the article that you had published, Stacie. Now, for those who are probably unaware, who is Premka, or who is Pamela, and what is her connection to Harbhajan? I know we've kind of alluded to it and mentioned it a few times already, but just in terms of kind of condensing all of that, like, where does this story start, and why does the book come out then rather than before, perhaps?
Well, Pamela Sahara Dyson was one of the early followers of Yogi Bhajan. Her given name by Yogi Bhajan was Premka. And she was with him with his first trip to India, the first yatra that they took. And she had a clandestine affair with him for many years while he was married. And she stayed in the organization. You know, she sued in 86. She left. She came back for a short period. That's a bit. She moved back to New Mexico. Whether she fully came back into the fold I don't really know. But it took her, from my interview with her, it took her a long time because it took a long time to process. I mean, I think she experienced a lot of trauma. She also had a lot of power within the organization. So we have seen on some of the documents when we did our boss piece, whether unwittingly, some of the properties that were signed over, businesses were signed over, she was part of those transactions. So I think it probably took her a while to kind of figure it all out. And she went and had a new life, and she finally found a husband and had children, which is what she wanted. And she had a life in Hawaii, and she's a very good writer. And I think she wanted to tell her story, and she worked on the book for many years. I think she worked on it for over 10 years. And it's actually, I think it's a very good book. I think it's a compelling story. I think she paints a sympathetic picture, and it allowed other women the opportunity to tell their stories too, because I think there was this accessible quality to it. She was, it was relatable. It was just these kind of universal feelings that women have. And so it's also at the beginning of the pandemic, a Facebook group starts, and people just start telling their stories, and they just keep rushing forth. And it's not even women in the first generation. A lot of the stories are also coming from children of some of the earlier followers, so the second generation, and they're telling stories of, sexual and physical and spiritual abuse at the hands of Bhajan, also abuse that happens in the boarding schools in India, some of the other camps. There were like camps, there was child swapping. So it's just this book really provides an opportunity for others to start telling their stories at a very opportune time after Me Too movement here in the United States, where women are finding a voice to tell those stories. So it's just kind of this perfect storm of Me Too, pandemic, and I think, you know, within 3HO, it also starts shaking the trees there. So people who are, you know, still devoted, they believe her story. They may have known her back then. They knew the story because a lot of people knew a lot of things for many years. So they're also given voice. But on the other side of it, there are people who will not believe it, will not see it, will not acknowledge the abuse or trauma. So, but the book does start that whole process.
In a way, it's kind of like the book is kind of like a Goldilocks moment, because when you can read the book, I think, from two perspectives. From the perspective of someone who's familiar with 3HO, it has this aha quality to it, where someone comes forward and they admit in their own name that he was having a sexual relationship with his secretaries. It's a first person testimony to that. And that's huge. That kind of confirms a lot of suspicions. If you read it without the perspective of someone in 3HO, in many ways, it almost just reads like a memoir of a failed romance. A lot of the crime and a lot of the abuse in 3HO is not in her memoir. It's often assumed that it itself is a Me Too memoir, but not really. And I think that kind of half measure of the memoir, saying some of the things that happened, but not by any stretch all of it, I think in a weird way, that's kind of a push for many other people, especially the second generation, to go even further. And I think, there weren't just rumors of Yogi Bhajan's misconduct and abuse at the boarding schools. There were activists who were online and who were telling their stories, kind of like telling them into the void for years and decades. And no one wanted to listen. And I think, maybe the memoir kind of put a foot in the door, but then you have dozens and dozens of men and women who were born and raised in 3HO who really, pushed the door open once and for all. And, not only in public, but also I think a lot of that work was done uncomfortably with their own families in their own homes, having reckonings with their parents and their aunts and uncles and with each other.
Yeah, and it also was powerful because, she had a powerful position in the organization. So that gave her credibility amongst the 3HO community. And both sides, it was, there's a lot of hatred towards her within one community as well. And, she's not in an easy position.
Oh, no, I can well imagine, especially when you're talking truth to power. But a question just, Philip, on what you were saying. So you'd mentioned that her book isn't, so a lot of people think her book is kind of like a Me Too book, and it's not necessarily that. But correct me if I'm wrong, she had already brought a civil case against him back in the 80s. So what abuse is outlined in relation, as in, I'm just wanting to clarify, as in, what abuse actually takes place in that relationship or that kind of setup, and then is it kind of like Premka releases her book, and what is the little bit that then comes out of that just kind of helps this cascade effect of everyone then is like, all right, I'm telling my truth now, because at least, as in, someone will believe me now, considering someone so powerful in that organization has come out and basically said something very similar.
I mean, the text from the case that's out there, it was never really meant to get out there. If I'm remembering correctly, someone actually goes to the court, requests the documents, photocopies them, and then they're transcribed they're put online very early on, I think, in the 90s. I think it's worth having people read that document for themselves. It's a very jarring thing to read, but it outlines fraud and deception by Yogi Bhajan, an array of abuse, rape and sexual assault, sexual battery, physical abuse, manipulation, financial abuse, a whole range of things. It really paints a horrifying and bleak picture of not only abuse, but kind of the manipulation and control that allowed that abuse to happen.
So correct me if I'm wrong then, from the little that I read before to prepare for this conversation, I'd come across that there were either a number of cases currently kind of against, I don't quite understand how it works because obviously Yogi Bhajan's dead, but there were a number of cases that were still running. I'm not quite sure who they're quite against, but it seemed to be that there were still allegations of what you kind of just described, essentially still pending. Like, what is going on, or do I have my wires kind of mixed up?
So what I think a significant recent development is the Siri Singh Ji Corporation, which is an umbrella organization for all of 3HO, has issued a reparations program, which essentially means they have admitted the harm. They have admitted there was harm perpetrated at the hands of Yogi Bhajan or people who have an official affiliation with 3HO or any of its other businesses. And people have filed claims against the organization, asking there will be some administrators who will evaluate those claims, and then they will assign judgments, and those judgments will come in the form of monetary compensation, maybe institutional change. And so that to me is a huge indication that the organization is recognizing the harm that was done by the institution that was built by Yogi Bhajan.
Just on just on the abuse and the criminality that's going on. So I think the picture that I've kind of put together so far from what you have been sharing is that Harbhajan's essentially kind of like some criminal don sat at the top of this kind of business structure or whatever. Now, my next question is, if anyone's watched The Godfather, they'll know The Godfather sits at the top and he has everyone else doing his dirty work. So are there other people involved, and what's happened to the, because obviously you guys have been referring to kind of there's abuse going on in the school, and this school's in India and he's obviously in the US, so he can't be in two places at once. So I'm already assuming there's more to it than just him. Is that the case? And what's happened to those people? Because I've not, and again, it might just be because I haven't researched hard enough, but I've not really come across anything that says anything or points a finger at anyone other than him.
Well, there is one lawsuit. And to be fair, I don't know the status of it. I have not checked in with the lawyer in a bit. But that was brought by a second generation woman. And within her lawsuit, this was right before my piece came out, she filed it. But within her lawsuit, she did name some other people in the organization. So there's some accountability there, but within the reparations, people can name other people. That are involved officially in 3HO, Siri Singh Ji, Kundalini Research Institute, Kundalini Research Institute, any of the organizations that have a connection to Siri Singh Ji Corp.
And I think the language of the reparations program, in a kind of informal way, it basically says people with official leadership positions in the organizations can be held accountable through the reparations program. but that doesn't include just anyone who was teaching the yoga or anyone who was connected. So if someone had a title, if they were running an ashram, if they were running a business, if they had a senior position, they kind of fall under the reparations program. But, the point that you brought up, Amr, of the Godfather and a mafia structure, it's not, I don't think it's that far from the truth. What Stacie and I found in reporting our piece for Boz was that the structure of 3HO was legal. The creating of a religion, and this play on words saying, I've created Sikh Dharma, the creation of a title, these corporate forms that allowed him to take over businesses and ashrams, that's all legal. The money that is coming to him in the 90s, that money is legal. Consulting, licensing, all of those things, that's legal. But that's not to say that there wasn't illegality within 3HO. There's a massive amount of illegal activities in 3HO. The comparison that I like to make is if 3HO has between 3, 4, 5,000 committed members, that's the size of a large high school in a major U.S. city. And if you start tallying up all the people that were involved in criminal operations, all the criminal operations, there's telemarketing scams, many of them. There's smuggling, there's fraudulent art sales, there's gemstone scams, there's the drug dealing, the drug smuggling. You put all that together, it's disproportionate. If you had a high school where you had 20, 30, 40 people involved in felony level criminal activity, that would say something.
And especially if the principal and the teachers are the ones who are doing the criminality as well, because it's that power structure of top down, which is what made me give the Godfather comparison, because it's like, and the only reason I say that is because like we have a family business, and like I can kind of understand some of the difficulties involved to get certain things off the floor. And this guy seems to be able to like flick a light switch on, and he's got millions of pounds, and everything seems to like just work. So it almost asks the question of who else is involved, because it just seems impossible for one man to be able to do all of that, unless I'm also then understating kind of how much he thought about kind of what he's doing and how to hide it and all the rest of it.
I mean, we did hear stories like he liked to see the books, right? He liked to see the numbers. Yeah, so he could get access to them, and so he'd look at them. But it was also this, and I guess perhaps you compare this to kind of mob-like behavior. It's like you're on a need-to-know basis. So some people know something, other people know something else, and then you don't tell those two people that thing. And so that's another way to manipulate information flow, which, subsequently can keep businesses going as well. And then there's times where we've heard he created conflict between people so he could get what he wanted out of it as well. So, it's a manipulative structure for sure.
Yeah, and a mob structure can work with only making two things clear. When you kick money up to the top, that's good. And two, no one's going to scrutinize how you get that money that gets kicked up to the top. And even from the things that are above board that we see, there's constantly appeals and praising of people who make lavish and generous gifts to Yogi Bhajan. I think one thing that there hasn't been any kind of reckoning for, and maybe it's because it's so spread out, is there seems to be a massive amount of abusive behavior done by Yogi Bhajan's senior students, these kind of, advanced, powerful, or recognized yoga teachers who have their little fiefdoms in the US and Europe and elsewhere. There are lots of stories about them taking advantage of and abusing and sexually assaulting students. And I think that really hasn't had a full reckoning or even a partial reckoning yet. Perhaps because it is, those are things that are spread out across the world and with many different people, not just one person, as with Yogi Bhajan.
And the yoga remains very popular. And so that creates nobody wants to hold the yoga accountable because people are making money off it.
Yeah. And I mean, I think there's a great comparison between the things that Punjabi Sikhs have told themselves to turn their heads 3HO to what people in the yoga world and Kundalini Yoga practitioners have told themselves to avert their eyes from what has gone on. Oh, a lot of good has happened. If we talk about the bad, then we'll eliminate the good. Yeah, 3HO is this strange Dara that's done all sorts of stuff, but they say Japji Sahib in the morning. A lot of them have no idea what they're saying. Literally, Yogi Bhajan says you don't need to know what Guru Nanak Dev Ji was saying in Japji Sahib. It's all about your mouth moving. It's a computer code. But isn't it so great? They're keeping cash. I mean, there's so many nonprofit advocacy organizations that push 3HO Sikhs to the front of their brochures and TV campaigns. If you relied on Sikh Coalition, you would, maybe be left with the appearance that 3HO makes up 25-35% of Sikhs in the United States. The same thing is true with the yoga. Once scandals really came out in 2020, 3HO started pushing another narrative. It's all about your personal experience. They put people of color at the forefront of their online pages and their ad campaigns. They start pushing medical science. Here are studies that show that yoga is good. Well, the studies don't really show that the yoga is that good, but never mind. There's medical studies. They pay people to do pseudo-academic works that try to provide some sort of foundation for Yogi Bhajan's yoga, or at least kind of cast doubt on people who would say otherwise.
We're getting towards the end of the questions that I had, and there's just two things that I wanted to clarify with you just before we move on. So, and this is just more so for people listening to kind of put some context to this, which is, first of all, how does yoga and Sikhi connect? So you mentioned earlier that Yogi Bhajan...
Doesn't.
Okay.
It doesn't at all.
So this is the thing. So you mentioned earlier Yogi Bhajan had kind of created these myths, not even myths, just for all out lies. Where does yoga connect to Sikhi? How does, because you hear all sorts of things. So I'll leave the floor to you.
I mean, I think a great, if you want to fully jump in to that history, Javala Singh from the Suraj podcast, he's done a 4-module course for yogic studies, all about the connections or the disconnections between yoga and Sikhi. What we can say, when you look at the Sri Guru Granth Sahib, when you look at Dasam Granth Sahib, when you look at Itihas of the Gurus, there are a handful of maybe ambiguous references to yoga used as a metaphor or as an ideal. Compared to those tiny bits, there is a massive ocean of clear examples where the Gurus themselves, the Bhagats say themselves, Itihas says itself, yoga is not the method. Yogis do not have the answer. Nanak chastising the Nath yogis and Siddh Ghosh, Guru Gobind Singh and Dasam Granth constantly chastising yoga as a fruitless method. Itihas, where the Gurus and their beloved Sikhs are constantly pointing at yogis as being delusioned, lost. It's incredibly clear. And I mean, I think the bigger point too is we have records of so much. We know the exact parries and thrusts that Guru Hargobind did with a sword at a particular battle. We know when Guru Tegh Bahar is ordering cloth, how much is he asking for? Who's bringing it to him? How much are they paying? Where is the connection? If the the Guru said so much about so much, if at any point they thought that yoga was a worthy pursuit, where are the records? I mean, you really have to go so far to find so little. You have people trying to say Pran Sangli is some kind of text that proves that Guru Nanak Ji was teaching about yoga. You really have to go to a disreputed text that has so much doubt cast upon it, that only exists so many centuries after Guru Nanak's life. There's nothing there. There is no connection. There is no history. That's it.
No, thank you for clarifying that. My next question was going to be, how legitimate then is what Yogi Bhajan's teaching is? You already kind of earlier answered that, and from what you just said there, it's got no basis in Sikhi, but within a yoga, within the field of yoga, is Yogi Bhajan literally just as in he's taking it from these different sources and just making it up on the fly, or is there, is it in any way respected at all?
Well, I think, this is Philip's expertise, but in general, yoga in general is a bricolage, right? American contemporary yoga, starting in the 20s and 30s, evolves into the 90s, to the 2000s, into a physical fitness regimen. And it's all a little bit made up. It all comes from gymnastics or, military exercises or dance, or, there's all it's all a bricolage. But within the actual yoga world, Kundalini Yoga has taken hold, like many of the other yoga schools, and it starts to get a lot of press and a lot of acknowledgement. Celebrities start doing it. They start talking about it. 3HO members are cooking vegetarian meals for celebrities. Some of these 3HO teachers are going on tour with rock stars to keep them sober. It's kind of sober minders. And I think what's actually, and I was kind of thinking about this the other day as I was kind of doom scrolling at all the yoga accounts on Instagram, and I saw this one person in particular, and his expertise is addiction, helping people deal with addiction through yoga. And he's using Kundalini Yoga, but he is not presenting at all like a Sikh. But he's using the mantra, he's using Waheguru 400 times, whatever it is. I'm going to wake up every morning, and this is going to be my sadhana to stay sober. And I was thinking, this is even, I don't want to, he can slide by without being attached to the allegations of abuse, because there's not this kind of physical notification that he is associating with 3HO Sikhi, but he is using the practice and is developed by 3HO Sikhs. So it's this kind of weird.
It's
almost good at the metaphor. What would that metaphor be?
But it's almost like the next mutation of what Yogi Bhajan's done, because it seems like this guy has, and again, I'm paraphrasing here, but it seems like he's seen what's worked, taken the bits that he can get away with, and then ensured that no one can necessarily connect the dots straight away. Obviously, because you're more aware than most, you obviously see straight through it, and you're like, well, actually, I can see what he's doing. So it seems like the next mutation of the plague that Yogi Bhajan started.
Yeah, I think I called it with another offshoot of 3HO. I called it the photocopy of a counterfeit bill. But I mean, the other thing too is, I mean, I think I've said this before, like there's a certain level of verification and scrutiny that you'd use if you purchased a used car or if you purchased an article of clothing and, you know, the stitches are already falling out. You could return it. You have the ability to question it. You buy a car, you get to see the title. You get to know if it's been in an accident. Why don't people have the same scrutiny or have the same rights when they invest in a practice that they are dedicating hundreds or thousands of hours to, that they're putting so much hope into? And I think that's one of the biggest, one of the scariest things about the continuation of it is, you know, despite, you know, these claims of like Harvard Med School studies, you know, where's the actual evidence? Where's the actual history that this stuff does what it says that it did? And for me, that's scary, that if you are going to this yoga to do certain things in your life, that means that you are not going to other things that are more proven, that could be more effective in doing that. And I mean, how would you feel, Amar, if I cooked you dinner and then I didn't eat it? How comfortable would you be with that? You know, oh, here's a great pasta dish. I'm not going to touch it, but have at it. You know, talk to Yogi Bhajan students. When did they see him doing the yoga that he was advocating? When do you ever hear someone say, oh, well, sometimes he would say he was doing it when it was a cover for other things in his room. But, you know, he dies incredibly unhealthy. You know, there are other yoga teachers, I would say more sincere yoga teachers, who are astute and healthy and active well into their 90s. How old is Yogi Bhajan when he dies? What's his condition? He's obese. He's got a repaired heart. He's got someone else's kidney, parts of his feet chopped off from diabetes. He's obese. He's on so many painkillers, he has to be tapered off before he can sign a document. He's in a wheelchair. He's on oxygen. Is that the death of a yogi? Is that the death of a master? And I mean, you know, I think one of the most devastating things in Stacie's article for Los Angeles Magazine, which I think points to the reality of, you know, is this yoga doing anything like it claims to? You know, you have a woman who is involved in the grooming of an underage child who then turns around and touts her yoga credentials and says, I'm a very intuitive person. If you're doing the yoga of awareness, how come you didn't see systemic generational abuse all around you and within your own home and within your own children? Really? You're doing a meditation to see the unseen and you don't even know what's going on with your family?
Well, I was going to say, I mean, that the way that it does continue is that there's this idea that we can separate the teacher from the teaching. And, you know, take what you want and leave the rest. So it's this very, but it works for me. Now,
Isn't that kind of like saying, I know there's a COVID pandemic, but I'm just going to take the best of the pandemic. Like, I'm going to try and get the best of the infection. So I'm just going to try and get like a headache and maybe a mild chest infection. But I don't want the rest of the symptoms. Like, I don't want like the feeling of being really cold and sweaty or whatever. You still got the virus though. Like, as in, like, I one of the questions actually that I'd written down was, can you kind of separate the teacher from the teaching? And I think I've kind of answered it myself in the sense that, well, it's just a plague. It's like, as in, before we had this conversation, I may have thought you could, but the more that you guys have enlightened me, the more I'm like, well, actually, everything seems to be rotten from the core. Like, as in, there's nothing that doesn't seem to have been untouched by either Yogi Bhajan or actually not Yogi Bhajan, by Harbhajan or the structure that he's put in in order to kind of, again, just always ends up at his feet or kind of wherever. But yeah, I'd love to get to know what you guys think. Like, can you actually separate the two? And what is the, like, kind of, how are 3HO now dealing with the fallout of it? Because as you said, I'm sure some of them are trying to distinguish between him and what they've taught, but can you?
I mean, I think perhaps the biggest conclusion that comes from reading our piece for Boz is abuse and misconduct wasn't an accident, and it wasn't something that happened after the fact. When you look at the corporate structure of 3HO, the claim title of Siri Singh Saab, it is deliberate. It's from the outset, and that control and that abuse extended to every corner of 3HO, the schools, the businesses, the abuse, the spiritual teaching, the claim titles, the political connections. It's all inextricably linked to each other. And it's kind of hard to step back from that big picture and think that you can just kind of break off a little corner or clean this part out.
But I think for some people, especially in the first generation, sort of following, their whole, they're in their 70s now. They've dedicated their lives to this lifestyle and to a religion that they feel devoted to. And, I have some empathy to separate the teachers from the teachings, to let that all go. And you're towards the end of your life, it would unravel everything you believe about yourself, your identity, who you are, how you move through the world, how you run your businesses, how you've raised your family. I mean, it's a really tough position to be in. I still don't think that justifies like supporting institutional abuse and the horrific trauma that so many people experience. But, I think some are handling it better than others, some are handling it better than others. Some have taken some accountabilities, and then there's others who are just like, no, this is, they're double downing.
Yeah. I mean,
So
I think it's worthy to point out that there are some people throughout the history of 3HO who did walk away. And there are parents who, the moment that they heard of abuse against their children, they were out. And there were people who, knowing that they would lose everything, knowing that they would perhaps lose their spouse, lose contact with their children, lose their lives and their community that they had for years and years, they still left. There were some people who, in the 90s, in the 2000s, even while Yogi Bhajan was still alive, they called things out. In some cases, they did it under their own names at great risk. And so it's a difficult thing because people did these things exceptionally. It shows that it could be done, but at the same time, it also shows how difficult and how exceptional doing that could be.
Yeah, and also trying to navigate it. And so with this reparations program, trying to navigate it while you're still in it is even more complicated. So if you're going to admit the harm and admit the abuse, but you're still going to work for one of the businesses and take, that's your livelihood. I mean, it's tricky,
It's complicated.
place to be. Yeah.
Yeah.
We said that in the Boz piece that, within that core group of 3HO members, almost every single person had at least one aspect of their lives that was under direct control of Yogi Bhajan. Their house, their job, their children, their religious identity, their spiritual practice. And it's complicated because while everyone while he did have that control of everyone, it would also be very hard to look at 3HO becoming what it became just through Yogi Bhajan's efforts alone. You know, he relied on his students and their expertise and their hopes and all that, but a lot of people, most people went along with it. And some of them went along with their eyes wide open and knowing exactly who he was.
Last question, and this is just kind of primarily aimed towards kind of the legacy of Harbhajan and the 3HO. Do you think that kind of, so I feel kind of at the moment, it's, although there's insurmountable evidence, there are still even people that I personally are aware of who contest everything that's been put into the public sphere, and kind of, again, as you were saying, they just put their head in the sand and pretend like this just never happened. Do you think, first of all, that the wider Sikh community will ever really be able to come to terms with it? And then secondly, I know 3HO are dealing, they've got this reparations system, and they seem to be dealing with it, but like, how much can you, if the man who's responsible for this is central to your teaching? Like, as in, unless they literally like remove every reference to him and every image, and like, as in, like, how, I guess, in to rephrase it, like, how is his legacy being processed now that all of this is coming out and everything's having to be reevaluated? Again, the example of his image being in the museum Amritsar is just insane. But again, it goes to show, like, I think that's quite a perfect example of going to show that his legacy is being contested, because some people don't want to remove his image from that place. So I guess, do you think it will ever, like, do you think they'll, like, as a whole, will ever really come to terms with it? And again, with 3HO, do you think that they'll, like, how will they be able to kind of not get over this, but kind of like get through this and kind of deal with all the repercussions of it?
Are you asking, like, what will this look like 30 years from now?
Yeah, I guess in a sense, yeah, like, as in, like, because for me, I don't quite see how 3HO could possibly continue to be 3HO, considering that is, like, as in, everything surely is pointed towards Yogi Bhajan in some way. So how do you think that they'll deal with everything?
Well, there's little examples happening now. I mean, and they're kind of, you know, piecemeal, but like some of the organization websites have taken his pictures down. Some of the yoga studios may have taken his pictures down. Not all of them. I was just looking at KRI, the Kundalini Research Institute, put up a new timeline on their website. And when they get to the Olive Branch report, which was the independent investigation that looked at the allegations against Yogi Bhajan, they have this very interesting language that does not mention sexual misconduct. You know, there's no link to it. It's just like a little couple sentences kind of buried in the timeline. So, you know, it's this kind of like, we're going to include it, but we're not going to really let you get deeper into it. And as I stated earlier, I think the yoga is just like a train that is just out of control and on a track. And I don't, that's going. The other businesses, you know, it's hard to know, because if this reparations program has to pay out a lot of money, it could be a financial strain. But it's hard to know how transparent they are about how much money they have as well. So all this to say, we don't really know, but there are some examples of how they might do it. And I think how they might do it is distance themselves from Yogi Bhajan and continue to align with the with the Sikh punk as, not 3HO Sikhs, but Sikhs.
And I think there are plenty of examples of other religious communities that have moved forward without having a full reckoning with what's happened in the past. I mean, in some ways, it feels very naive and idealistic to assume that like, justice would have to be done. There need to be a full accounting. There are many, many people out there who are totally fine moving forward. And I think, kind of a big thing with the yoga and with the businesses is, 3HO moving forward does not have to meet a standard that's really any higher than what the next crop of yoga teacher trainers or what consumers in the supermarket are willing to accept. You can make claims that this is not right. Survivors can demand a certain kind of accountability or justice, but if people keep lining up to pay for yoga classes and teacher training programs and retreats, if people still keep patronizing the businesses, that doesn't really matter. It'll keep going forward, business as usual.
They are. No, definitely. Yeah, okay. Just processing, like we've been sat here for 2 hours, and I just have to say thank you for obviously making the time to do this and for answering some of the questions, all of the questions, again, very well, but also it's like there's just so much to take in. This is a bit of a random question as well, but like, there was that Netflix documentary on Bikram yoga like a few years ago, and that was nuts. Like seeing some of the stuff that he was doing, like standing on their back and like whatever, all this crazy shit. Is that comparable to what is going on with Yogi Bhajan? Like, is it as like crazy as that, or is it more structured? Crazier. Yeah.
But I mean, like,
It's, I guess a group class is kind of insane.
yeah,
Like 7 to 11 minutes of breath of fire, which is basically hyperventilating.
yeah.
I mean, Bikram,
Hold your arms up for 15 minutes.
But see, the thing about Yogi Bhajan that's different than Bikram, right? Like, so Bikram kind of centers himself as like the teacher. So Yogi Bhajan's like, no, you're all going to be teachers. Like, all of you can go out and spread out and like do my thing for me, so I don't have to stand up or sit down or do anything, right?
Yeah, and he also early on starts franchising them. I mean, it's funny because I actually said this in a class a week ago where, that's kind of the financial model of the yoga world right now. You don't make money teaching class. You don't make money by having 10 people take your yoga class. You make money by having a teacher training program. And that's like most successful yoga teachers and yoga studios, they have retreats and workshops and teacher training programs. And I saw that on Instagram today, posts like, you're a teacher, you just don't know it yet. You love yoga, then you should be a teacher. And Yogi Bhajan's doing that immediately. And I think that's why it spreads, in 69, 70, there are people who've been taking his classes for like 3 weeks. And he's like, you go to Memphis, Tennessee, you go to Boston, you go to Milwaukee. And so you don't have to deal with all these students in your home turf, but like they're spreading. And that was his other thing too, of like, because Bikram could actually do the yoga. Yogi Bhajan couldn't. And like, I remember he would say something like, teacher doesn't demonstrate, a teacher doesn't touch the students. And after a while, you're like, you might not be able to get up if you wanted to. No wonder you're not going to correct postures.
But the other thing, I think the thing that is comparable, and maybe this like transcends just the yoga. So, Yogi Bhajan and his students characterized him as a Saturn teacher, which basically gave him license to be an asshole, like to be mean, and aggressive and challenging because you deserve it. You know, I'm gonna dress you down, but this is good for you. So I think Bikram's attitude and aggressiveness, you know, and kind of meanness, like that would be a similarity. But in terms of the physicality of the actual yoga, like adjustments, no.
I mean, in a way, it's like, it's cynically brilliant of like, you get a pass by putting it in plain sight. You start things off by saying, I'm going to be a complete jerk to you, but it's for your own good.
Yeah.
And then you can do things that no one would ever allow to be done to them if you did make that weird kind of loophole for yourself.
I just want to say thank you, because you guys have been more than patient, and it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to both of you. But can only just say thank you for doing this.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure.
No, not a problem. What time is it where you guys are? Because it's like 11 p.m. here.
It's almost 3.
Okay. So you've got like the rest of the afternoon, evening at least. All right, that's not so bad. If you managed to make it all the way to the end of another podcast episode, this would be a great time to ask you to like, comment and subscribe. It means a whole lot more than you could imagine. Also, a quick shout out to all of our YouTube members who are supporting the work that I do, including Jas S, N Singh, Gavin Shergo, Prab Amrit, RB, Gary Parwar, GS, Gurpreet Danjal and Radhajit Kaur. And also a shout out to our Patreon members Neil B, Hernan Pezzano, Jazz Dylan, Gurpreet Singh, Gurdi Bath, Himmat Singh Khalsa, Anish Mar, Ramneet Kaur, Mani Singh, Rav Singh, Ramneet Kaur, Amardeep Basi, Yasmin Jaswal, Gagan Singh and Kajinder Singh. If you want to support that work that I'm doing, you can do so via 2 methods, either become a Patreon or join and become a paying member of my YouTube channel. So if you are interested, check out the links in the description below. Otherwise than that, hopefully see you in the next video.